was in Chicago, and he got an idea to take magic out of the stage or out of the parlor, if he wasn't necessarily much of a parlor magician, but to take it out of that performative place and put it in real life. What he did is he went into the jail there in Chicago, and he said he invited some reporters to come along, and he said, "Listen to the jailers." He said, "I want you to lock me into a cell. I want you to chain me up, and I want you to see what happens." So, of course, he gets out with ease because what people may not know, didn't know maybe at the time, was that Houdini was very obsessed. Houdini was obsessed with magic. He was obsessed with escape. He was obsessed with handcuffs. He actually had a tremendous collection of handcuffs. Anywhere he could go, he would get another kind of handcuffs. He was an expert in handcuffs. And by the way, expertise is a very important aspect of Houdini. He was not a person who was lettered. He was not highly educated. He educated himself, and in a very, very focused kind of way. Well, this was real life. This wasn't some trick. This wasn't a show. This was somebody going into a real jail cell and coming out of it, escaping. And people were absolutely riveted by it. He got his name in the paper. Here he has this in his scrapbook. You can see a picture of his scrapbook. And he has this notice of how he manages. I love this way they're talking about him. They say he's a strolling magician, very different from on stage. He is someone who can do magic in the real world. And this sets in motion this idea of escape. It's something that appealed profoundly to everybody. All of us, every one of us, have something we want to escape from at some point. Whether it's some kind of pain that's physical or emotional, some situation, it's a very deep thing in the human psyche, I think, to have moments where you feel that you are trapped. Houdini, by being a person who could escape anything, and he did it literally and symbolically through these handcuff escapes. He became someone who appealed to something profound in humans, and it is crucial to who he became. Now, from this start, he started going around and doing public challenges. He would invite people. He would do shows. He would invite people. He would put it in the newspapers. He would put posters up. One of the things he did, one of his publicity stunts, is he had some gentlemen who didn't have as much hair on the top of their head, and they would have H. One of them would have H, one would have O, one would have U, spelling out his name on their heads, and people would walk by. They would take their hats off and bend their heads down, and it would say Houdini. And he did all of these kinds of things, but the main thing was the challenge. He would challenge people to bring handcuffs to his show, and he would get out of them. And this became central to what he was doing. Now, he was still doing magic, and he was still doing this metamorphosis escape. In fact, one day the stars aligned for Houdini, and there was a gentleman named Martin Beck who was in charge of the Orpheum Circuit of Vaudeville. This is the era of Vaudeville, of course, and this is 1899, crucial year for Houdini. Martin Beck saw Bess and Houdini, Harry and Bess, perform. And he looked at the show and he said, okay, it's a magician. Houdini has something, there's something about him. There's a charisma about him. But he said, the real thing you have to do is you've got to focus on the escape acts. That was the focus. Now, in terms of the escape acts, that meant metamorphosis, and it also meant a whole lot more of those challenges with the handcuffs. And here you get, and notice how he says it, nothing on earth can hold Houdini a prisoner. Very powerful marketing. Now, suddenly, Houdini not only started to perform and Bess in the United States, but he actually ends up going to England. Things were a little rocky at the start, but he actually found himself in Scotland Yard and managed to escape from some chains there. And suddenly he was off and running in England, in Germany, and he was a native German speaker. So he got along quite well in Germany. He wound up in France, and he wound up also in Russia. And here are some of the images to be associated with Houdini. some very, very fascinating things involved. And, I would say this. I'm going to tell you just one story from this tour. Now, this went over the course of time, not just 1900, but over the course of years, he was making trips all over the world. And, but one of them I think is pretty interesting. There's a story that Houdini was going to be, he was in Moscow and he asked some people there, what would you like to see happen? And there was an old lady who said, I have not heard the bells on the Kremlin ring for years. I would love to hear that. And Houdini says, I will make it happen. And next thing you know, the bells were ringing. Now, I'll tell you this story mainly because it's almost certainly not true. It's almost certainly not true. It's a story that was told by Orson Welles, the great director and actor and auteur, who was also, by the way, a magician. And he told this story. But the brilliant thing about this story is not really whether or not it's true. It's about what Houdini was using magic for. He was trying to make the impossible possible, to take something that someone had not seen or heard for a long time, and make it happen again. Something that would hit levels of nostalgia and memory and hope, and to make a dream come true. Now, for Houdini, that was really the core of magic, and that is really magic at its best. When it's able to do something that in our regular world you can't imagine being possible. Can't do it. Well, Houdini finds tremendous success. Now, by the way, he had promised his father upon his deathbed that he would always take care of his mother. And he promised his mother that he would one day come and empty gold coins onto her lap. And Houdini found tremendous success. It's said that at one point he actually was able to purchase with his great riches now one of the dresses that had been made for Queen Victoria, and he took that to his home for his mother. Whatever the case, it seems that this did work out. Now, there was at the bottom, you'll see one of the kind of very special handcuffs that are very famous. Some of them are very famous, by the way. I suppose one of the most famous was the so-called mirror cuffs. Took Houdini he had a very difficult time getting out of it. Some have thought that maybe Bess kind of slipped him a key, but many say he didn't. By the way, there's another great Bess and Houdini story of her slipping him maybe a key, possibly. This one was also in Russia. He was going to be loaded up in one of those prison carts and taken to Siberia. Turns out that the night before, he had gone and they had sort of modified, you could say, one of those carts to help him escape from it. Well, at the last minute, the authorities switched him to a different cart, and this one was not set up. And the story is, or at least one of the stories is, that Bess was so distraught about her husband having to go to Siberia that she rushed up to him and she kissed him, and that maybe in that kiss she might have passed the key to him to get out. Who knows? Again, a lot of mysteries, and Houdini, maybe more than any other magician, left behind tremendous number of those kind of secrets. Well, these are some pictures of Houdini in his accustomed attire for escaping. In fact, this might be a little more than he would usually wear. One of the things that he did, and as you can see, he's in very great shape, good-looking guy. And so even though he was famously, they say, a bit of a prude, but he at least understood on some level that he could sort of sell his body on some level, and the sexuality of that kind of a scene. You can see he's all chained up, and this was part of the thing. He would say, "Okay, I have nothing up my sleeve if I don't have a sleeve to have anything up." So there he is in this kind of style, and these kind of posters, these kind of pictures made their way around and kind of began to add to this legendary kind of status and existence that he had. Now, with all of his great riches, Houdini, on a trip back to the United States, actually went up to 113th Street. It was in Harlem. And in 1904, he actually purchased a house, and he's paid a pretty good bit of money for it. And I guess adjusted for our time, it would be at least 700 and something thousand dollars, maybe with the recent inflation we've had, who knows, maybe up to $1 million, I don't know. Anyway, they had this house, and he began to fill this house with all kinds of things. So Houdini, again, I'm going to say this again, he was obsessive. He was obsessed about magic. He was obsessed about having every kind of handcuff in the world. There was no piece of paper too small for Houdini not to collect it. Everywhere he traveled, he looked for anything on the history of magic, books, papers. If he knew there was a magician around who had if alive, he would try to meet that person. If he found out a magician who had, no matter how obscure the person was, who was buried in a certain area, he would want to go and visit the tombstone. One wonders when he ever slept. He collected art. He began to create tremendous archive, and he just became more and more expert. And this house was filled with books. He was constantly getting books and having them shipped in. This was a constant thing in his life. And this all played out into his own writing. Now, there were a number of books that he wrote, and I should tell you that when Houdini wrote, he did not always do the writing himself. He was not at all above um, getting ghostwriters or collaborative writers. You might be surprised to hear that one of his collaborators was a young H.P. Lovecraft, the very famous mystery writer. Another writer who worked with him a lot was a very young Walter Gibson, who later went on to write, oh, I don't know how many novels about the character the Shadow. So you might know that radio character, Walter Gibson, famous for the Shadow, but he actually was involved in magic quite a lot and worked with Houdini. Now, here are some of the books: The Right Way to Do Wrong, an expose. And you notice this expose thing. It's a very important part of Houdini. Again, it's a very interesting paradox that someone whose life was all about deception was so absolutely rabid about not being unethical, about exposing deception. He was a deceiver, and yet he wanted to expose deception, including spiritualist exposés very, very early on. Anyway, 1906, he actually wrote out a Secrets of Houdini in 1907. And then there was this one. Now, Houdini, taking his name from Robert Houdin, but on a trip in France, he managed to find Robert Houdin's, I think it was his widow, and she kind of blew him off. She kind of said, I don't, she didn't really want to talk to him. And it upset him to the point that he actually turned on this magician who had been so foundational for him. And he actually ended up writing a book entitled The Unmasking of Robert Houdin. Now, this is an interesting dimension of Houdini, and it's a paradox about him, that not just about deception, a deceiver wanting to expose deception, but also that he was someone who was very charismatic. He went all over the world, bringing people together into the Society of American Magicians. He was the president of that. He was, by the way, a joiner, big joiner. In fact, at the height of his fame, he loved the idea of a club. He actually created a club for people who had been successful sons of rabbis, so people like Al Jolson. And but anyway, he really was very charismatic, and yet at the same time he was very prickly, and he was very known for getting into very public fights. He was very kind of edgy kind of guy in a way. Easily took offense. He had a kind of, there was a vortex around Houdini. I guess you could say he had an enormous ego, but that maybe doesn't quite get at just how obsessed he was with magic. And I think that was really the center for him. Many people would probably disagree with me on that, but certainly there was ego involved. Everything for him, it was about him. It was about magic. It was about his success in that. Well, this book, and there were others, but this one was particularly kind of ugly, actually, toward Robert Houdin, and it's sort of the not so nice side of Houdini. Well, after years of doing handcuff escapes, there were a lot of people who were imitating him. And by the way, he would always call them out if he could. But so many imitators that he finally decided, I'm going to have to start upping the ante. And of course, this is the nature of this kind of performative style. You've got to do something a little bit more spectacular. And probably one of the most famous of the things that he did, so often connected with Houdini, was the milk can escape. He had this kind of giant milk can. First performed in St. Louis in 1908, and he would get into the can and he would be locked in. It was actually very dramatic. He would start out and it would be filled with water, and there would be a band playing, and he would jump into the water, and then he would it would displace the water. He would come out and people would see that the water was displaced, and he would say, "Now listen, when I do this, I'm going to do it for real this time, and I want everybody in the audience to to hold their breath with me while I'm locked in here trying to get out. We get a big breath, and then we go back down into the water. Again, the band was playing this thing, and by the way, they would add more water so that it was clear that it wasn't displaced, and then they would padlock the lid down. Curtain would be drawn. Minutes would pass. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. How could he stay in there? People were on the edge of their seats. Now, by the way, Houdini was already out of there. He was sitting behind the curtain reading the newspaper. Sometimes his people working with him were worried that people in the audience could hear him. Finally, if everything was at a fever pitch and nobody could imagine how he could be alive, and you were facing in that audience the real possibility of death, then Houdini would come falling out behind the curtain, drenched, out of breath, playing this thing to the hilt. But it was one of the great, great escapes, and it brought this incredible drama to the stage.